Okay, so let's look at your questions for discussion board 7. First question is from Kacie on page 304 and 305. Brown provides 8 characteristics of speech that make the listening process difficult. Is there one of these characteristics that students seem to struggle with the most? If so, why is the characteristic of spoken language particularly difficult? Okay, so let's just have a look at those particular difficulties that Brown suggests that learners have. Um, so the first one there is clustering or spurts or idea units. And this is true of any language, is that when we speak, we speak with spurts of words, usually no more than 6 or 7 words. Another word for this is an idea unit. So our focus of consciousness moves in these spurts of speaking. That in itself is true of all language in a sense. So that is not something fundamentally new for students when they're listening to English. It's something that they've had to learn to do in their own language. Redundancy is difficult because what is redundant? When we speak, we use a lot of repetition. We use a lot of repairs because we've said something. We re-express ourselves. We use words like I mean. So being able to filter out what is repetition, what is redundant, is extremely important. One way of getting at that, of course, is to be, once you've done some listening practice, is at the end of it, maybe to use a small extract of a transcript and be able to point out to students what are the redundant parts and what are the content parts that they need to pay attention to. What's very difficult, and this is probably one of the most difficult things in English, and this is connected really with stress, rhythm, and intonation, number 7 there, is in English is the particularly many different reduced forms. English is a stress time language. It works on certain beats. And a stress time language tends to kind of push all the sounds, mush them all together from one beat to another. So G yeah is one beat, right? And there's one stress, vocal stress there, and everything else is smushed up into it. So one of the things we know about English is that there's not a very good correspondence between the phonological sound of English and the actual written form of English. And that is one of the really, really difficult things to do. And that's why in the lecture on songs, I particularly work with a particular song and try to draw students' attention to what are called the rules of fast speech. And the rules of fast speech are all the different ways that sounds are smushed together. So the one example that the book gets, the classic one is Jita. Did you eat yet? All smushed together. Performance variables, post games, that should say interviews, excuse my spelling there. Um, I give an example. The book gives an example of an interview with a sports personality, and if you ever listen to post-game interviews with athletes, I mean they're totally vacuous. I mean they're not saying anything, and like anybody, like all of us, it's very hard to respond to a question about, well, how did you feel about when you scored that first goal? So there are going to be lots of performance variables, people not able to articulate in clear ways. But the point there, of course, is that's not the kind of listening material that we need to expose students to. Colloquial language is something that, of course, we can begin to teach and isolate. Rate of delivery. What is difficult about the rate of delivery is that often it varies in a particular piece of authentic speaking. We have parts that are quite rapid and parts which are quite slow, and that's actually done for certain effects. Well, if we distort language too much, I mean, in non-authentic language, if we slow it down too much, then we're not going to have the kinds of things that are happening with reduced forms that are happening because of stress time language. So it's important to use authentic language, but be aware that of course, there are particular rates of delivery which may be too fast, or particular extracts of listening which have too much variable rate of delivery. I think stress, rhythm, and intonation are the most important as well with reduced forms. As I said, in terms of uh, English as a stress time language, you do a lot of work looking at where the stress is in a particular utterance and showing what happens to the sounds in those beats. And so you can do a lot of practice in speaking on, of course, on rhythm and intonation. Interaction refers to listening in a conversation, speaking and listening. And that's probably, I think, less of a problem for students because they don't always get that opportunity. And if they do get that opportunity, they can have particular strategies asking for repetition and clarification that they can use in those situations. So, yeah, the ones I'm picking out there are reduced forms and stress, rhythm, and intonation. Okay, Kathryn says the text mentions that there are often redundancies in speech which at first can hinder the learner but eventually can work to aid the learner as they figure out what parts of the speech are repeated. How can a second language teacher best help a student learn about the words that indicate pauses or redundancies in spoken language? How can the teacher help the student learn how to use these words to their advantage? Okay, so there's two parts to that. There's the receptive abilities to screen out redundancies, and then the productive ones to use them in one's own speech. And I've addressed that earlier in the earliest response to Kacie, that when you've done a listening for content and you've focused on form, you can produce extracts of those transcripts of those speaking texts and focus on and show the particular words and phrases which do express redundancy. So that's from a receptive point of view. It's not always easy to be able to use those in a productive way, but you can pick out some of them and allow students to gain time by using phrases like I mean, what I want to say is, let me say that again, etc. Next question, James. During the SAM lecture, there was a discussion of how to choose an effective topic. The lecture outlined that a more general or universal theme works best. Could the SAM topic be more specialized and less general in a classroom that is focusing on a certain language genre? Yes, certainly, of course. The fundamental point here is the notion of background knowledge. So if you're going to do a listening about something and you can guarantee students have some background knowledge, using their top-down processing, they can make a lot more sense of that listening than one which they have no background knowledge for. So that's why, in terms of general English and general listening, I'm suggesting you use particular more universal topics that you can know that your students have some background knowledge of. Of course, if you're teaching in a classroom of English for specific purposes, then you're going to be working with those very specific listening texts. So if you have a classroom of students who are going to be tour guides, or they're going to be working in hotels, or they're going to be software engineers for iPhones, then you need to sort of have listenings that reflect those particular restricted set of background knowledge which is key to those students' success in terms of using English for the job market. Knowing that, if you're going to use a very specialized piece of listening and you know students don't have the background knowledge, then you're going to spend a lot of time providing the background knowledge so that when they get to the listening, you've created those schemata, you've created that background knowledge. Anthony says, as the eighth characteristic points out, interaction is crucial to attaining listening comprehension. With a large class, you inevitably have to break the students up into small groups and pairs. Sure, they can negotiate meaning and practice turn taking as any conversation will entail, but how do you account for the fear that students may pick up bad habits from listening to their fellow students? I think the actual fear of this from a particular research point of view is far exaggerated. Um, Remember that children learning their first language uh, um, start off in a very limited one word, two word uh, use of the language, and that's gradually filled out as they acquire the language fully by the age of 5 or 6, right? So there are particular stages of development that students are going through. So it's very hard to say, oh, they're picking up bad habits. Uh, um, the more important thing is whether the students feel that they're picking up bad habits, because if they feel that, then they're not going to want to work in pairs like this. But pair work is the essential way of maximizing talking practice in the classroom. So it's something we have to work with, and in an EFL situation, is often the only kind of chance the students have to use the language. So again, you're going to be monitoring your student practice. You're going to be looking for errors and then building your syllabus based upon what you hear. So the next time, next class, you can feed in some of those errors. You can feed in some of those phrases we talked about earlier that could be used for redundancy to help students give them time to express themselves. Sarah says, I think it's easier to teach top-down exercises because they tend to be more interesting for learners. How can you make bottom-up exercises more interesting as well? So a bottom-up exercise would be something like a dictation, where you're very concerned with the actual intensive use focus upon the language used. And there are lots of ways of making dictations interesting. Most of the traditional dictations are done individually with the teacher reading a text, right? Um, but there are many variations where you can have teams, groups of students working together. There's a great dictation idea, which is a running dictation. So you take a text and you stick it on one side of the classroom, and then you break your students into groups, and there's a runner. They take it in turn to be the runner. One runs to the text, reads it, tries to remember it, comes back, and then says that to the person who's chalking on the board, and then they go backwards and forwards, right? What's great about that is that they're talking about it, they're looking at the text and trying to use their knowledge of grammar and how words are put together in a sentence to maybe make changes in it. So there's lots of ways, creative dictations like that we can focus on the particular use of words from a bottom-up point of view. And what I suggest in the listening, of course, is once you've done some global listening, you might want to look at um, some bottom-up listening. And I gave that example with the song, My House, taking a little piece of it and just seeing what you can get, what students can get. And of course, everyone wants to know what's said in a song, so songs are great material to use for bottom-up listening. Bailey says, I cannot help but feel that listening comprehension is a skill that would be much easier to gain when it comes to the English language specifically, seeing as we have so much English-centered media, all kinds of music and television shows and blockbusters that are seen all over the world and are incredibly popular, done in English. Is it reasonable to believe that students learning English as a foreign language have an advantage over English-speaking counterparts because of this? Yeah, quite clearly. Let's just underline that the greatest library, perhaps the greatest library in antiquity, is YouTube. YouTube is an incredible resource, and I urge all teachers to be library scientists of YouTube and to find listenings there that they can direct their students to. The revolution in terms of access to language, and of course more so to English, is something that's happened over the last 30 30 years. When I was teaching English in Italy in the 1980s, the only way that you could actually get to listen to English would be going to one movie theater in town that showed movies in the original. All movies in Italy, and still to this day, are dubbed. That's the law. So you couldn't actually hear them in the original apart from this one movie theater. Well, and then we used to have a movie night at school where a couple of guys would come along with a huge, great projector. We couldn't choose the movies. The sound was often bad. And then, of course, in the 80s, we get the VCR and the ability to copy. And then you can begin to build up those libraries. You have access. And of course, in the 90s, the internet and the explosion of access to information. Right. Yeah. It's a huge, great revolution in being able to access great listening material. Okay, thanks for those questions, and I'll see you next time for discussion board 8.